joining us is Professor Allan. Welcome to the show, and welcome to New Zealand.
Thank you, Michael. It's nice to be back. My wife and I and our family had 11 great years in Dunedin, down in the South Island, which was a terrific place to live.
Oh, so you were a law lecturer there as well?
I was there from 93 to 2004.
And you've been a professor at University of Queensland for how long?
Since I left Otago, 2004.
Right. Okay. So you know New Zealand well. You understand our history, our culture, our heritage, our law, our democracy. How did you come to be writing an academic overview of He Puapua?
I basically got commissioned by Democracy Action. You know, I'm one of the 3 conservative law professors in the Southern Hemisphere, so I don't normally get commissioned to do very. We can't travel on the same plane together, Michael. It's too risky. Universities lean left so much. There's lots of data on this in the U.S. It's so you can go through university and never get exposed to any conservative ideas if you pick the wrong sort of courses. But anyway, I got this email and then a call, and they said, "Would you like to do this?" And I said, "Sure." And so they sent over the He Puapua. I hope I'm saying that correctly, but who knows? He Puapua report. And boy, is it ever a radical report. So it wasn't that hard to write an overview after you read it. It's you know, they want to undercut. They come as close as you can to saying that they want a whole new constitution. And what your readers or listeners need to know is that New Zealand's constitution is one of the 2 most successful ever. If you look at the history of modern times, there are 2 constitutional setups that have stood the test of time. They're both in the Anglosphere. You know, France is on number 5, and Italy, they stopped counting how many constitutions they have. But the 2 that have stood the time are the dicey British parliamentary sovereignty unwritten constitution that New Zealand exactly has, or the American Madisonian checks and balances. And if I had to pick between those 2, and they're both great, I would take the New Zealand parliamentary sovereignty constitution. This is the constitution that made New Zealand the first country in the world to give women the vote. It had the 4 set-aside seats for Maori in 1867. It's the constitution that was so flexible. New Zealand was the first country to bring in social sort of democratic reforms in the early 1900s and rejigged the entire economy in the 1980s. And on the basis of some, tin pot little UN declaration, which isn't even a treaty, and even if it were a treaty, the democratic credentials of international law are barely above 0. They're all entered into under the prerogative power in the Westminster world.
Now, just explain that for our listeners, because when you talk about prerogative power, James, I don't think most New Zealanders are aware of how we sign up for international treaties without coming to Parliament.
Okay, so in the English-speaking world, there's the American way and everybody else has the British way, which is sometimes called the Westminster model because Parliament in London is at Westminster. So the Americans take treaties seriously. If a president decides he wants to enter into a treaty the way Bill Clinton did with the Kyoto Protocol, it doesn't become a treaty until he brings it back and the upper house, the Senate, has to vote supermajority. You need 2/3 of the Senate to approve it, which didn't happen. So nothing, it's just gone. So it's very difficult. The Americans take treaties very seriously, and they're very hard to bring into being. In the Westminster world, what I call the prerogative power, that's the sort of fancy title for executive power. So if you go back to Henry VIII in the 1500s, he basically had all the power. He was an absolute monarch. And then there's this non-linear fight with Parliament that goes on for a few centuries. And so in the Westminster world, we have the language of Henry VIII time. We pretend that the Queen in Parliament, that the Queen or the Governor General is entering into these treaties, but they're not. The reality, as Badgett said, is it's the Prime Minister and Cabinet. So if John Key wants to sign up to a treaty, or worse, something with lower status, the UN Declaration, he doesn't have to go through the legislature. All he has to do is convince enough of the Cabinet that this is a good idea, and it's done. Like you could blink your eyes like a genie.
Which is exactly what happened in this case.
Right, that's why I used the example, exactly what happened. And so it has no real democratic warrant or legitimacy compared to a statute. A statute, you vote for people, everyone counts the same. You might not like the party that wins the election, but they go on and have a legislative agenda. Some of it they put to the voters before the election. and they passed the statute. Now, that has real democratic legitimacy. It treats us all equally. When you enter into a treaty, or worse, a declaration, when you ratify it, it's just the Prime Minister has decided that this is a good idea, or he was able to convince enough of Cabinet. And so it's done under the executive power. Now the trade-off...
So you know that, were you in New Zealand when John Key was Prime Minister? No, you weren't. You would have been in Queensland by then. I was not. And they entered a relationship with the Maori Party. Peter Sharples, I think, was the co-leader of that Maori Party then. You get the feeling with John Key that he probably agreed to this as some sort of sop to the Maori Party of the time, because it actually was I don't know if you're aware, James, it was actually announced at the UN that we were signing it by Peter Sharples, not by the Prime Minister. I suppose you know that.
It probably was a sop. I mean, in theory, the trade-off in our part of the world is that when you have a treaty, it has no standing in the domestic law. So when people say the Treaty of Waitangi has no status domestically, you have to incorporate it into statutes. So you'll find provisions in statutes that say they're incorporating the treaty or any treaty. And so the trade-off in the British world was always that, well, so we entered into a treaty. So what? You can't go into court and argue that this treaty has any sort of legal standing unless it is incorporated into a statute.
But in New Zealand, you can.
Well, no, you're still not supposed to. But this document, He Puapua, is professing, or it's arguing that this declaration has some sort of, high legal status, and I suppose what John Key thought is, well, this has just got, we can give this away, it's a fig leaf, but this is a mistake. It's a mistake for two reasons anyway. One reason is the clear trend around the Anglosphere in the last 40 years is that judges have moved left. If you go back to the 1950s, the median lawyers' views were considerably to the right of the median voters. Today, the median lawyers, because they've all gone through pretty woke law schools, the median lawyer's view is considerably to the left of the median voters. And you're choosing your judges from the lawyerly caste. And the more decision-making that's done by judges, the more, and I'm generalizing, there are exceptions, but the more your decisions are going to be woke, progressive, left. And so I don't know why a regular median voter wants to hand decisions to the lawyerly caste. If you want some of the most woke workplaces, go into a big law firm in Auckland.
Yeah,
you probably have to give your pronoun on the...
Well, the classic case, James, is the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. It was put into legislation by Jeffrey Palmer in the late 80s. We've never, ever discussed it as a country. We didn't know what they actually even meant. Gosh, the Labour cabinet didn't know. I can remember getting that directly from Mike Moore, who was sitting around the table at the time. He said, what does this mean? Jeffrey just said, just a few words. And now... This
is the Jeffrey Palmer who wants a written constitution.
That's right.
This is the Jeffrey Palmer who said that the Bill of Rights would have no standing, no legal effect on statutes. I mean, I would not, that's a good sign not to do it, really, to be totally honest.
Well, I think they found that out to their leisure, at their cost, actually, because, as you know, and I think anybody who knows, they left it to the courts to determine what the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi are, and left out completely, as a consequence, any public discussion and any democratic decision by elected representatives.
And when you talk about principles, you're usually talking about vague, amorphous vessels you can fill with anything you want. I read the treaty when I worked here many times, and this talk today of the principles of the treaty, it's all just the after-the-fact creation. It doesn't seem all that historical to me, what you read. And that's another thing the He Puapua report wants to... They seem to want to create some kind of, and it's never really specified, written constitution, which will have inserted into it the UN Declaration and the Treaty of Waitangi. And then it will be left to, as I said, the lawyerly caste from which judges are chosen. And these judges will... And not only that, once it's written, they'll be invalidating statutes they don't like.
Yes, and that is a point that you've made. I read your article also on the Australian. I think it was published over the weekend on this matter. That's the point you also make that it is made. I made it in the preamble to the show today, that the document clearly says, or certainly cabinet papers consequent to He Puapua clearly say, listen, we're going to have to change the law as a result of signing up to this declaration. It's quite explicit.
And of course, they don't have to. I mean, in theory, the declaration has no legal standing unless they incorporate it into a... So what they mean is, in order to achieve the political outcome we want, we're going to have to change the law. And of course, they didn't signal that, or at least to the best of my knowledge, they didn't signal that before the last election.
No. But it's in their cabinet papers. I quoted from it this morning. It's a cabinet paper that came out a couple of months ago. You've probably seen it, in which they say, while some of our laws and policies are not consistent with the declaration, any change to specific policy and statutory settings, i.e. the law, to achieve consistency with the declaration will be made over time. So they're clearly indicating that they're going to.
Yes, well, the remedy in a Westminster system like New Zealand's is to vote for a party that undoes this. Now, the problem is on the right side of politics, the empirical evidence over the last few decades is they don't. I think, one of the arguments, whatever you thought of him, the reason he's still wildly popular in the U.S., Mr. Trump, is he said he was going to do X, Y, and Z, and then he did them. And that's pretty refreshing for a right-of-center voter. Normally you vote for Stephen Harper, and he doesn't do it. Or you vote for John Key, and sure, he lowers taxes by 6%, but he doesn't really do anything else. Nobody fights the culture wars. And so we're looking for a sort of conservative party that will do some conservative things. And I know we're all, at least I'm labeled hard right, but my views, you couldn't put a piece of paper between my views and John F. Kennedy's. I want a little bit smaller government. I'd like individuals to be responsible. I believe in national defense. And in today's world, progressives say that makes you a hard right person. Again, there's no difference between my views and John F. Kennedy's until you come to the subject of hookers in the White House.
You're an old-fashioned liberal at the end of the day.
I guess so. The whole political spectrum has moved in the last 20 years. I mean,
yes, it has. Yeah.
Another thing that's remarkable is rich people now, and I generalize, they vote left. Over in the recent election in Australia, we just had the 20 poorest constituencies, 16 of them voted liberal, right. And the wealthy constituencies voted green and left. Hillary Clinton took the 100 wealthiest counties in the U.S. Boris Johnson does not win expensive inner-city London seats. So left-wing people with a lot of money and the ability to virtue signal, they used to vote right, but now they vote left.
Correct. Now, the other thing that comes out of He Puapua, I'm quoting direct from the document, is the vision. It says the vision of He Puapua is that Maori should have the ability to exercise full authority, not just some, but full authority over our lands, waters, and natural resources. Now, I can see that they might have some lands, but they still want full authority over that, James. But they don't own any waters, and they don't own any natural resources apart from a little bit of greenstone down the west coast. What are they talking about?
Well, much of the report is sold under the aegis or label of co-governance. It's just a different word for partnership. And so what you're supposed to take away from this, and if you just say the word partnership or co-governance, it's a sort of happy talk, and if you have someone in the background strumming Kumbaya, it feels okay. But what they're really saying is that one part of the population, which is about 15%, will be on the same footing as everyone else. Now, how that is sustainable is beyond me. And the report anywhere tells you how we're going to define who counts as a Maori, which is a really big question if you're going down this road. So is it going to be a blood test, some sort of genetic test? And what level of the blood test is it going to be? Is it going to be an elite, sort of tribal elite who pick? Because what about the inner city Maori who've been cut off from the tribes? I know when I was in Dunedin, they often couldn't get scholarships. So are they going to count? Is it going to be a self-identifying test? And once you've decided who the Maori are going to be and who's going to have the power to decide who they're going to be, you then get into the questions you raise. And it's very problematic. The whole report is peppered with stuff that basically doesn't define what they're going to do, but points to a direction that looks like what you're traveling down in this road with the three waters and the health reforms, if you want to call them reforms. And so I know the government says this is not a document that's driving policy, but it sure looks like it. Oh, no,
I mean, yeah, I think that's a lie, really, at the end of the day. In fact, the Maori Health Authority is something that they clearly signalled that they wanted, and it has been delivered to them. Co-governance in three waters, another good example.
And so, with the health reforms, is it true that you will get a different level of health care depending on your the sort of genetic makeup you bring to the table, because that's not, as I say in my response, this report wants to deal in equity rather than equality. It tossed away the sort of old-fashioned liberal values. And liberalism is basically a system of government that focuses on the individual, and it takes that Martin Luther King idea that you don't pay regard to someone's skin color or what kind of reproductive organs they have. You treat them as a individual. You look at their moral character, and hardworking people do better and whatever. But this report largely deals in equity and group thinking, and you assign little cogs to a particular group, and then you look for statistical outcomes where the group sort of matches their percentage of the population, or in this case, way more than their percentage of the population. So it's a very illiberal document. It takes a very bizarre view of what a democracy is. It's not even clear that it likes democracy, because democracy is we all count the same and we vote, and sometimes you're on the winning side and sometimes you're on the losing side. Suck it up.
The other thing, James, is in the executive summary, which you'll have read, obviously, it makes the point that I think the last 2 points, He Puapua only forms the first step towards the creation of a declaration plan. So we now know that Cabinet's advanced that declaration plan and has said, right, they've done I guess you've seen that they've done the consultation with 350 Maori. And now they're on to developing the declaration plan and presumably just in mandating it. But it says here, any plan must be progressed through engagement and partnership with Maori. Well, that's what they're doing at the moment. So there's the next step of He Puapua taking on a corporeal or a real, if you like, feature. So it's not just something that's a bit of a think piece in the background. And then it says, New Zealand is the first state to embark on a process for a declaration plan and has the capacity to be a world leader in realising Indigenous people's rights, especially if it is ambitious. That doesn't sound like they want to go slowly, does it?
Well, no, and even at the first step where, they pretend, it's very presumptuous to assume that you talk to 350 Maori and they are lockstep in tune with yes. the millions of Maori who live. I mean, there's lots of Maori who would think like Martin Luther King. And so that they've jerry-rigged the consultation process to deal with the kind of people who would be at home in a Maori studies department in a university. Mm-hmm. But I have lots of friends when I was in Dunedin, and not everyone thinks like this. And why should they? It's a pretty illiberal way to think. And you're right. The response to this, the proper response is a political one. Vote for parties that promise to undo this. And if they don't promise to undo this, don't vote for them. Because this is as you say, you have to stop the momentum and turn it around.
Now, that is the political answer. I think the ACT Party, who is entertaining and hosting you tomorrow at Parliament, have made that commitment. What about the National Party? Are you having any contact or discussions with them?
Well, as one of my favorite British comedians, Lee Mack, says, I think you're confusing me with admin. I'm not really sure who I'm meeting with, to be totally honest. They've just brought me over, and I've got lots of meetings, but I don't remember anyone from National. Here's the thing. National looks a lot like, to me, like the Morrison government that just deservedly lost in the recent election. I was never the biggest fan of John Key. Yes, he brought the tax rate down from 39 to 33, but on things that really mattered, including getting rid of your terrible MMP voting system, he didn't do anything. He spent an inordinate amount of time trying to change the flag, which failed, but his legacy is pretty Spartan and exiguous, right? And that's what happens when you don't want to take on the progressive forces. And to some extent, you pay the cost of that. It's a bit like Stephen Harper in Canada, although he has a bigger track record than John Key. And so and by contrast, Scott Morrison has no legacy at all, because he not only didn't take on any fights with anyone, he also was the biggest spending, biggest taxing government in Australia's history. He deserved to lose, in my view. So the problem is that the inclination for people when they get into Parliament, especially on the right side, is not to pick fights.
Great.
And it's in the context where most of the media is incredibly left-wing because they've gone through journalism schools at universities. And I still cannot believe in New Zealand that you have this $55 million fund where a supposedly independent press takes money from government. This just staggers me.
No, it's bribery. I mean, it's corruption of...
It's a sort of Pravda-like compliant press. They should be embarrassed to work at those outlets. I take it Fairfax is one of them.
Fairfax, well, they sold... I don't know if you're aware that Fairfax sold their New Zealand operations for $1.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, there was losing money hand over fist, so they've retreated back to Australia, and they sold it for $1 to the staff, essentially. And so you can imagine with the corporate lens off, it's gone way left.
Fairfax is bad enough as it is if you look at the age.
Yes.
To have a staff collective running it, where it'll be like a journalism department in a university.
Yeah, it's pretty much like that. And so they've got 25, 30 staff who are paid for by that journalism fund, and they've signed up that they've got to report the news in a certain way when it comes to Maori issues.
It's so embarrassing for them, I'm sure.
Well,
or no, even more embarrassing if it's not embarrassing.
Well, I mean, they used to say that how can you tell an honest politician? And the answer to that question was when they're bought, they stay bought. I guess that's the way we're talking about an honest media this country, because they've been bought in a big way.
Well, people will become aware of this over time. There's quite a few studies in the U.S. now that the American media, the legacy media, doesn't move political opinion at all. As people just realize they're overwhelmingly, there wasn't a single newspaper that endorsed Trump, and I think other than parts of Fox News, there wasn't any broadcasting, and still he won in 2016. So there's enough people who now realize that why would I vote based on what the press tells me? Because we know what they think.
Yeah, and that undermines our democracy too, as you know, because it means that you're looking for sources of information, and you can go down some very odd roads then.
Yes, you can, but there's no one to blame but the press. I think the problem was when, this is my view, so this is just off the wall, but I have some old journalism friends, and they said when journalism used to be a craft where you'd come out of high school and then you'd sort of apprentice, that was much better than when they go through high school, then they go to some woke journalism university degree for 4 years, and then they hire them. It was much better when people came into the newsroom and they learned on the job, and I tend to think that's right.
That's right. In fact, I was offered a job, I can tell you that, 50 years ago it would have been, and you started as a copywriter, and then you just simply worked your way up. And you're right, all those old-fashioned journos are gone. The biggest question then was report the facts. That was the other thing. And now what we've got is a journalism that is determined to report the opinion of the writer and then bend the facts to that opinion.
Yeah, because these young people come out of university, they want, and within 2 weeks they want to make a difference, whatever that means.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yeah. They all want to be Woodward and Birdstein, except they don't want to have to do the research to do it. Now, the other thing, can I just ask on He Puapua, and that is there something similar to this happening in Australia with the Aborigine people? Did Australia sign up for this as well?
It's not. There's nothing similar to this because this is so aggressively sort of radical, and you can't change the Australian Constitution without a referendum. There is talk right now in Australia, something called The Voice, which would be a third legislative body that would sit as an Aboriginal only sort of makeup. There's no details on it yet because they've been talking about it for a while now, and they know that as soon as any details are sort of filled in, let me put it a different way. When you talk in vague abstractions, you can sort of keep a fair few people on board. But the minute you deal in specifics, you start to lose some of your coalition.
That's a good point.
And so they can't really talk about what this is going to look like. But the new Labour government has said they're committed to bringing it to a referendum, but I think it'll lose. And I think it'll lose even if the Liberal Party signs up, which I don't think they will, but they might. Australia's had 44 constitutional referenda, and only 8 have ever passed. And I think that's because most of the propositions that are put to the voters are turned down. Australia is one of the few countries in the world where you can't change the Constitution without having a Swiss-style binding referendum. So in Canada, the political class decides if the Constitution will be amended. In the U.S., it's the political class, so you have to get a certain percentage of the two houses of Congress and then 3/4 of the state. So 2/3, 2/3, and 3/4. In Canada, you need to get both houses of Parliament, politicians, and then a certain number of the provincial legislature, politicians. Australia puts it to the voters, and that means sort of things that the political class love. So if we had the Canadian system, we would be a republic in Australia, right? Just about every politician wanted to move to be a republic, but when they put it to the voters, it lost in every state. And again, the republic looked pretty popular in polls until they actually had to deliver some sort of model, and then people realized there's no real good way to move from a constitutional monarchy to a republic, because you're going to have either an elected or unelected president, and they will not have the same status as the Governor General. Our system works best because the Governor General has no legitimacy. It's like throwing a dart at the phone book. You want someone who has no opinions on anything. They show up when there's a hurricane, they cut school ribbons, and they don't talk about... That's the great thing about Queen Elizabeth. She doesn't talk about politics. She just shuts up and gets on with her job. She's been terrific. I don't think her son understands his role. He shut up. You cannot get that core illegitimacy of a Governor General, someone who's just picked and really doesn't have any role except once every 100 years. There's a question about which in a hung parliament, which party to put in. So there are some reserve power issues. So I like the constitutional monarchy largely because it works. And the problem with a republic is it's almost impossible to come up with a system that works as well.
Which is what you're saying about He Puapua as well, in terms of the New Zealand. We've got an unwritten constitution. You're saying that it works very successfully. It stood the test of time, I think, is your direct quote.
Well, it's the British Westminster Dyson unwritten constitution that is the longest-standing constitutional model in the democratic world. And together with the Madisonian American checks and balances model, these are the longest-standing constitutional models in the modern world. And one of the traits of a conservative is you don't throw away something that works on the promise of a utopian, aspirational something or other that we can't really specify. That's the sign of our utopian radical, and they almost never work out.
But He Puapua is going to change that. He Puapua, we know it's being enacted. I mean, there's a further work being done by Cabinet on terms of making the declaration work. The declaration plan, they call it. We've seen a Maori Health Authority, which is one of the recommendations. That's been mandated and now is ready to take wings. Three Waters is promoted or has promoted a co-governance model where Maori are elevated to having a say over a resource that they frankly don't own and never have.
I know, a lot of water infrastructure that's just gone in the blink of an eye. So I don't know what the local council people are thinking about this.
It's really interesting you should ask that question. I think local councils aren't generally creative thinkers in this country. What are they like in Australia, James?
Yeah, I think a lot of people see it as a stepping stone into higher level politics.
Oh, well, it's exactly the reverse here. It almost goes the other way. But can I say, though, James, there is a great upset in this country about Three Waters, not just in the co-governance model, but in really taking away assets that don't belong to the government and having them just systematically picked up and run by people that not only don't own them, but also don't probably even live where they're delivering the water services to. So, yeah, the National Party has said... Sorry, my underlying view is that this would be a great political fight to pick. And, that's my political instinct. Now, having said that, I should tell listeners that I also was completely wrong. I thought in Australia that there's no way Australians would stand up to the sort of biggest inroads on their civil liberties in the last 300 years during the lockdowns, that they would just meekly allow the political and bureaucratic and public health clerisy casts make a series of calls that as the data comes out, and we see now that Sweden has some of the best statistics in Europe,
the lockdowns were a disaster. There's like 500,000 kids under 5 in the poor world that have died because of the economic decisions that were made over lockdown. Lockdown is going to go down, in my view, as one of the worst public policy set of decisions in the last 300 years.
Totally agree.
My view is every politician who did that should be voted out. I'm glad Scott Morrison lost because that's one of the main reasons. And so, but I was shocked at how many compliant Australians walked around. Mate, they're all wearing their masks.
Well, you've come to Mask Central. You're in New Zealand now. You could be in downtown Beijing.
I have read every single. There's 14 randomized control studies about masks. So that's the Goldwater, and none of them show any evidence that masks do anything. Then there's observational studies, and those cut both ways. You can point to Florida versus California. Florida, no mask. California, and Florida statistics look better. Now, is that a scientific? No, it's observational. But when you actually look at the studies that do stuff, I mean, imagine, why would you think that a mask that is a cloth mask that people take off to eat and then they put it on and off, and it's not a high grade, why would you think that would work?
Well, we've had that discussion many times on this program. There is a great deal of kickback, I guess, and now it's actually easy to evade too. You just go to a website and download it.
Through the whole lockdown, I just thought, what are people doing? This is such a despotic overreaction. I mean, you weren't the worst. Victoria was the worst. But there was 100 years worth of data in November of 2019 that the WHO in Britain had accumulated on how to deal with these sort of pandemics, and none of them, and they all said, don't lock down, give people the information. It was basically the Swedish model. He's the great epidemiologist there, Anders Tegnell, just said, I just copied the data. And in the course of a month, based on China welding people in their homes, almost every democratic country, there are exceptions, Florida didn't, and South Dakota didn't, and Sweden, but it was such an overreaction. And no one cared about the costs.
No.
I mean, kids miss 2 years of school.
Yep.
They never make that up.
Yep, you're absolutely right. Yep, it's a gross overreaction.
Level of benefit. Yeah, it was just all benefit thinking and no cost thinking, and the costs are huge. Missed cancer checks. So I was never really. I just thought, and it's even worse because you get labeled. They say, well, you don't know the medical data, but the people who signed the Great Barrington Declaration, those are the 3 top epidemiologists in the world. Gupta at Oxford was basically pilloried. And she just said, this is not the way to deal with this. And I think the data is now proven they got it right down the line.
Yeah. No,
So I am not in the position to predict people's behavior because I never predicted that Australians would be so compliant. And that's come as a bit of a shock to me, how a sort of fear porn press combined with pseudo medical experts, and I don't want to sound derogatory here, but the kind of people who end up in the public health bureaucracy tend to have come near the bottom of their medical school, and they're not the best epidemiologists you find at Oxford, and they were just making up rules that had no rational sense at all.
Well,
you can't go outside, you can go 4 kilometers, not 5. It was just a series of irrational rules imposed on us. Really annoying.
Okay, well, you're going to annoy some people in New Zealand with your views on He Puapua, but I know that you're not going to back down on it, and you've got strong academic and legal credentials to argue.
I've been married 36 years. I annoy my wife on quite a few occasions. So you get used to it, really.
All right. James, thank you so much for being here. I enjoy your next couple of days, enjoy your time, and you have a message that I think needs to be listened to by everybody. It's been a fantastic to have you on the platform this morning.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me on. And I think you live down in my old part of the world. Are you in Wanaka or somewhere?
Yeah, in Cromwell actually. But I know I did my degree. I did my degree at Otago University as well, and I did some law papers there too. So you might remember Mark Hennigan.
Mark Hennigan is a great man.
He is indeed.
Yes.
Well,
he's up in Auckland now. He's a great.
He was the dean of the law school. But yeah, great man. James, have a great one. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Professor James Allan. He's the visiting, he is Professor of Law at the University of Queensland. You would have heard that he had been brought over here by Democracy Action, who are a group determined I guess that's the same sort of corollary as the Taxpayers Union and the Free Speech Union, but they're different again. Very strong on the idea that let's preserve democracy. It's not a bad system, and let's resist challenges to it. He Puapua is one of those challenges.